My name is Major Violet Hines, 32, United States Navy. On my first range drill, the SEAL Admiral laughed at my call sign, Reaper 0, and told everyone I was just a tourist. The stopwatch read 5:42. He didn't know what that number meant, but soon he would. What would you do if you saw this in real life? Drop your thoughts below and don't forget to subscribe. My name is Major Violet Hines. I'm 32 years old, a combat helicopter pilot who has spent most of her career flying through weather that made lesser pilots pray. My call sign is Reaper 0, earned the hard way on a night when ice, wind, and rotor blades all tried to kill me at once. To some, that name carries weight. To others, it's just a patch to laugh at. When I received orders to Naval Base San Diego, I didn't expect a warm welcome. An Army officer flying rotary wing suddenly inserted into a Navy-led task group was always going to raise eyebrows. Still, I didn't expect the hostility to come so quickly, or so openly. The first day I walked into the joint planning cell, the air already carried the sharp tang of rivalry. Navy khakis, Marine greens, a handful of Air Force liaisons, and then me, in Army flight uniform, with a subdued Reaper patch on my sleeve. The man who set the tone was Vice Admiral Kalen Hayes, a decorated SEAL, tall, lean, with a voice that filled a room. He had the kind of aura that made junior officers stiffen 2 seconds before he spoke. He was revered here, feared even, and he knew it. Hayes ruled the task group like his personal fiefdom. To him, I wasn't a peer, or even a respected outsider. I was an interloper. At our first quick reaction briefing, the Navy officers presented slide decks with smooth, rehearsed confidence. My turn came. I laid out my annex, cross-domain search and rescue standards, stopwatch benchmarks, handoff windows for air and sea assets. Numbers, not theory. Hayes leaned back in his chair, scanned the room, then looked at me with that smile men use when they're about to dismiss you without consequence. Reaper 0? He said, his voice carrying to every corner. Cute. What do you plan to reap out here, Major? The surf? A ripple of chuckles ran through the room. Someone coughed into his fist to hide a grin. I kept my face still. My hands rested on the podium, knuckles white but steady. I answered evenly. Sir, I plan to reap minutes. They're what survivors run out of first. The laughter died, but Hayes' smirk deepened. He had marked me. And the others, sensing where the power flowed, fell in line. From that moment, the nicknames began. Garden Club Theories, Army Tourist, sometimes whispered, sometimes loud enough for me to hear. It was never clever, but always cutting. The power imbalance was clear. One admiral's smirk outweighed my entire record of combat flying. Still, I had one weapon they underestimated. Discipline. I logged everything. The times I was cut off mid-sentence. The slides lost from the briefing packet. The distribution lists that somehow excluded me from updates. I recorded them in my green notebook alongside engine start times and hoist deployment numbers. Data doesn't laugh. Data doesn't look away when you enter a room. It just waits to be read. Life in the planning cell was suffocating. Conversations died when I walked into the break area. At the coffee urn, mugs clinked nervously until I left. Officers who had spoken to me one day suddenly discovered urgent paperwork the next. The silence was its own language. You don't belong here. The only relief came on the flight line. There, among the whine of turbines and the tang of jet fuel, rank mattered less than reflex. Deck crews respected results. If you could start an engine cold and hover inside 6 minutes, they noticed. They didn't smile, but they nodded. Out there, my stopwatch still meant something. Inside the walls, though, Hayes set the rhythm. He carried himself like a man who had already won every argument. And maybe on paper he had. He wore the stars. I wore the patch. In the military, symbols matter, and his shone brighter. But stars can't erase facts. And facts, written in stopwatch seconds and hoist cable lengths, have a way of surfacing. I didn't know yet how soon that would matter, or how far the conflict would go. I only knew this. Admiral Hayes laughed at my call sign. And I wasn't about to let the truth of Reaper 0 be turned into a joke. The mockery didn't stay in the briefing room. It followed me into every corner of the base, quiet at first, then bolder as they sensed no one would check them. At the morning muster, a young lieutenant raised his coffee cup and whispered just loud enough for his friends to hear, "Reaper 0, does that mean 0 rescues?" They laughed in tight private circles, but the sound carried. My rank meant little when the man at the top had already branded me a tourist in his kingdom. In the planning bullpen, I learned the games quickly. My slides for a secondary briefing vanished from the shared folder on Cybernet. A captain claimed it must have been a technical glitch. Another time, my watch bill assignment for the rehearsal disappeared. I was told it was an oversight, but somehow everyone else's billet was correct. Each cut was small, deniable, but deliberate. They weren't trying to defeat me outright. They were trying to erase me, piece by piece, until even I questioned why I was here. At the coffee station, the ritual repeated daily. Conversation would die the moment my boots crossed the tile. A pause, the shuffle of sugar packets, then safe talk about weather or baseball would resume. Nobody asked me about flight envelopes or rescue protocols. My presence was an inconvenience to be ignored until it passed. Still, I kept my bearing. I logged every detail. The dates of the missing slides, the exact time my billet disappeared, the words whispered at the muster. And in my green notebook, alongside those notes, I logged the stopwatch times that were my anchor. From engine cold start to hover, from rotor spin to rescue hoist deployment. I knew the numbers down to the second. 5 minutes, 42 seconds. That was the truth that could not be erased. Haze grew bolder with each passing day. During a session on amphibious integration, I laid out a plan for air-sea handoffs that reduced response time by nearly 20%. He let me finish, then leaned back with that familiar half-smile. "Cute theory, Major, but the Pacific isn't Iowa cornfields. Out here, storms don't care about your stopwatch." The room chuckled. A captain next to him shook his head, smiling. I stood straight, hands resting lightly on the table, face impassive. My voice was calm when I answered. "Storms don't care, sir. Survivors do." The words hung in the air for a moment before Hayes cleared his throat and moved on. But I saw it, the quick flicker in his eyes, not of respect, but of irritation. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not in front of his officers. As the days passed, the insults shifted from quiet jokes to outright pressure. Hayes called on me in meetings not to contribute, but to corner. "Major Hines, perhaps you'd like to tell us how the Army handles blue water navigation?" The laughter followed like clockwork. Even the junior officers played their part. One afternoon, during a planning huddle, a lieutenant spread a chart across the table. "We were told to test the Army math," he said with a smirk. "Can your Reaper numbers beat the Admiral's tide tables?" His friends snickered. I didn't rise to the bait. I walked them through my figures, cited doctrine, referenced actual rescue logs from Alaska and Guam. They stopped listening halfway through, eyes glazing. But I finished anyway. Because professionalism isn't about whether someone hears you. It's about whether you said what needed to be said. But beneath the silence, cracks were forming. I saw it in the eyes of one deck chief who watched me timing a mock run on the flight line. His lips pressed tight, but he gave the faintest nod when I hit 542. Out there, among turbines and salt spray, respect wasn't a gift. It was math, and math doesn't lie. That night, as I closed my logbook, I realized something Hayes hadn't considered. Mockery might sting, but it also built pressure. And pressure, applied long enough, doesn't just break the weak. It sharpens the prepared. The Admiral could laugh at my call sign all he wanted. Numbers were patient, and sooner or later, the truth in those seconds would demand to be heard. The test came on a night deck, under the blinding glow of floodlights and the salt-stained haze of the Pacific. It was part of the literal response exercise, a rehearsal designed to stress every weak seam in the plan. The Admiral had been waiting for this moment, and so had I. The inject hit just before midnight. A comms degradation scenario paired with a notional casualty at sea. The red cell had stacked the odds. We had to launch a rescue bird under degraded systems, track a missing diver, and recover them inside a strict window. On the catwalk above, Vice Admiral Hayes presided like a judge at an execution. He had been needling me for days, setting the stage. Now he had the perfect opportunity. He raised his voice, carrying across the roar of turbines. "Major Hines," he called, "since you're so fond of your stopwatch, why don't you show us how it's done? Cold start, full crew. Let's see if your Reaper math survives contact with reality." A ring of officers and sailors formed, eager for the spectacle. Some had their phones out. Others smirked. They expected me to stumble, to confirm every joke they'd whispered in the coffee alcove. I walked forward, calm, deliberate. My boots rang against the steel deck as I pulled the green notebook from my pocket. I flipped it open to the right page, the ink smudged from long hours in the field. "Copy, sir," I said evenly. "Starting the clock." The deck chief looked at me, then at his crew. Something passed between us, an understanding forged in the language of procedure. He gave a sharp nod. "Crew muster, time," I called. 3 sailors ran to their stations, shouts echoing over the din. "APU start, time." The auxiliary power unit whined to life, the turbine building to a scream. "Engine 1, Engine 2, time." Flames spat, then smoothed into steady whir. "FMS quick load, time." Navigation system flickered green. "Hoist check, time." Cable rattled, then stilled. Each call punctuated by the snap of my stopwatch. My voice was steady, my cadence precise. The crew moved like a drilled machine, their skepticism replaced by instinct. This was not about me anymore. It was about doing it right. 5 minutes, 42 seconds. From cold deck to hover. The stopwatch clicked. I raised my hand. "Mark." Silence rippled across the deck. Sailors who had expected a clumsy army pilot fumbling with unfamiliar systems now watched a Black Hawk lift clean into the night, rotors chopping through the haze. Even the smirkers stopped laughing. For a moment, the only sound was the low thrum of the bird holding steady above the deck. But Hayes wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Cute parlor trick, Major, but this isn't a simulator and it isn't Alaska. Let's see your stopwatch handle this." He held up a red card, the kind used for injects, and read aloud. "Survivors have drifted into shoal waters outside the designated corridor. Hines's annex is invalid. Scenario continues." The circle chuckled again, emboldened by his authority. My demonstration had landed. But Hayes had snatched the moment before it could harden into respect. He laughed openly, turning to his staff. "Ladies and gentlemen, behold Army math. Works fine until the ocean changes its mind." The others joined in, the sound rising above the rotor wash. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply noted the time in my log and closed the cover. Facts were patient. Hayes could laugh, but the truth had already been written in ink and seconds. The humiliation didn't stop there. The next morning, during the after-action review, I sat silently at the long table as a junior officer presented a new idea for streamlining air-sea handoff. It was my concept, lifted almost verbatim, only clumsier in his delivery. He stumbled through the details, but the shape was unmistakable. Hayes leaned forward, smiling broadly. He clapped the officer on the shoulder. "Now that is forward thinking," he boomed. "This is the kind of initiative we need." He didn't glance at me. Not once. I sat with my pen poised above the page, unmoving. The laughter from the others stung less than the silence. It wasn't just that my work had been stolen. It was that everyone accepted it. The good old boys club at work, neat and efficient, erasing me with a smile and a pat on the back. But I wasn't broken. Not yet. I let the humiliation settle into my bones, a weight pressing me down. Then I remembered the stopwatch. The 5:42 inked on the page, undeniable. That was the truth. That was my weapon. And I knew then that this fight wouldn't be won on a deck or in a briefing room. It would be won in the shadows, with receipts that no smirk could erase. The night after the exercise, I couldn't sleep. The laughter from the AAR still rang in my ears, sharper than the whine of any turbine. I sat in my temporary quarters with the green notebook open in front of me, the number 542 circled 3 times in ink. They could mock me in public. They could steal my work, but they couldn't change what the clock had recorded. I decided to test a hunch. At 0200, I walked across the deserted base, my boots echoing against the pavement, and used my clearance to enter the Secure Records Facility, the CF. The room was kept at a constant chill, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It smelled faintly of dust, paper, and ink, the scent of buried history. I requested a file under an innocuous designation: Incident Report, Literal SAR, Pacific Fleet, 5 years prior. The index tag had caught my eye earlier because the inject haze threw at me on the deck, shoal drift outside the corridor, was almost identical to the scenario described in its summary. The clerk retrieved the binder without question. I signed for it, hands steady, and carried it to a corner desk. The file was sanitized, pages heavy with thick black lines from a redaction pen. After action reports, comm logs, threat assessments. Whole paragraphs had been blacked out, leaving behind a mockery of a record. I flipped page after page, discouraged. Then I saw it. A comm log entry, time-stamped minutes before the incident went critical. Blacked out like the others, but the ink density was uneven, thinner. I angled the desk lamp low, pulled a thin sheet of paper from the printer, and laid it over the redacted line. With the side of a pencil lead, I shaded carefully. Slowly, like ghosts surfacing from fog, letters appeared. Pilot recommends abort. Overruled by CO. My breath caught. I shaded faster. The final word emerged with sickening clarity. Haze. The implication was devastating. The same admiral laughing at my stopwatch had once overruled a pilot's judgment in a storm, sending men into danger. And now he was burying the truth under layers of ink and ridicule. I didn't take photos. That would have been a breach. I wrote down reference numbers, page counts, and timestamps. I signed the file back in, every step logged, every move by the book. If the system came for me, I would not give it grounds to call me reckless. The next morning, I walked into the briefing theater, the weight of the discovery heavy but steady on my shoulders. A surprise awaited. 2 civilians in suits sat in the back row, silent, impassive. Rumors rippled through the room. Observers from the Inspector General's office, maybe even the Joint Ethics Board. Hayes saw them too, and though his face betrayed nothing, I caught the faintest stiffness in his posture. He began the session with his usual command presence, pacing in front of the projection screen, booming voice filling the room. Ladies and gentlemen, war doesn't follow checklists. It punishes hesitation. That's why we test. The civilians said nothing until halfway through the discussion. One leaned forward, his voice calm, surgical. Ghost knife. Execute the integrity drill. The words cut the room in half. Officers froze. Chairs creaked. Hayes's hand, mid-gesture, stopped in the air. Ghost knife wasn't a phrase you ignored. It was a pre-authorized code for an embedded oversight procedure, a drill used only when command credibility itself was on trial. Major Hines, the civilian said, turning to me. On the record, your cold start to hover time, last exercise. 5 minutes, 42 seconds, sir. Logged in my book. Produce it. I opened the green notebook, flipped to the entry, and slid it forward. The room leaned in, officers craning necks to glimpse the numbers. Data in ink. Unimpeachable. Now walk us through your annex, the civilian continued. Handoff windows, survivors in shoal drift. I spoke clearly, citing the doctrine, the benchmarks, the risk thresholds. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Procedure carried its own authority. When I finished, the civilian turned to Hayes. Admiral, confirm receipt of X reference package. Pacific SAR incident. For the first time since I'd arrived at San Diego, Hayes faltered. His eyes flicked, recognition sparking. His jaw tightened. Acknowledged, he said, voice low. The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter I had endured. 40 officers sat in stunned quiet as the balance shifted. My stopwatch, my notebook, my receipts had forced the truth into daylight. The admiral who had smirked at my call sign now stood frozen, exposed not by my anger but by protocol. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the logbook, the ink steady beneath the fluorescent light. Because this wasn't about victory. It was about truth. And truth, once spoken under code, cannot be silenced by rank. The fallout didn't explode in a single dramatic moment. It moved like a slow tide, washing over the base in whispers, personnel changes, and carefully worded memos. By the end of the week, everyone knew something had shifted. The first sign was subtle. Admiral Hayes arrived at the morning staff meeting 15 minutes late, a rarity for a man who had once weaponized punctuality. His uniform was crisp as always, but his voice lacked its usual fire. He went through the motions of the agenda without theatrics, avoiding eye contact with me or the civilians who still sat in on every meeting. His authority had been clipped, not stripped, but trimmed in a way that everyone noticed. Word spreads fast in the military, faster than any secure message system. By midweek, junior officers were muttering about ghost knife in the chow line. The phrase had taken on a life of its own. I could hear it in the cadence of their conversations, used like a talisman, shorthand for accountability. Nobody laughed when my call sign came up anymore. Reaper Zero wasn't a punchline. It was a warning. The official consequences came next. Hayes was formally censured in a closed-door session with Fleet Command. I wasn't invited, of course, but the news leaked within hours. He was placed under review, his pending promotion package frozen indefinitely. For a man who had built his entire identity around climbing the ladder, it was a blow more severe than any court-martial could have delivered. The officers who had mocked me most openly felt the ripple, too. Captain Rollins, the one who had repeated my analysis word for word and gotten applause for it, was reassigned to logistics in Guam. No fanfare, no explanation. Just orders in his inbox one morning and a flight manifest by evening. Lieutenant Connors, the one who'd laughed loudest on the range, found himself on permanent night shift at the simulator bay. His swagger disappeared as quickly as his sunlight. Even the rank and file began to adjust. At the range, I noticed recruits approaching me quietly after drills, asking for feedback, careful with their tone. The same young men who once smirked now carried notebooks, scribbling down my advice. It wasn't respect won by force. It was respect redirected by consequence. Still, I didn't gloat. I kept my routine steady. Morning PT at 0500, flight hours logged, reports submitted on time. If anything, I doubled down on professionalism. Because in the military, victory isn't about humiliation. It's about survival inside a system that eats arrogance for breakfast. The system itself began to recalibrate. New memos arrived from command about integrity audits and drill transparency. A revised protocol manual circulated, including new clauses about stopwatch verification and independent observers at range trials. What had started as mockery in a hangar had now rewritten procedure across the fleet. But the most profound consequence wasn't written in orders or protocols. It was in the silence. The silence had changed. Where once it was heavy with dismissal, it was now weighted with consideration. In the chow hall, conversations quieted not because people were excluding me, but because they were listening. In the briefing room, eyes didn't slide past me anymore. They lingered, waiting for what I'd say. As for Hayes, the change was unmistakable. He still wore the stars on his shoulders, still carried himself with the rigid bearing of command. But the arrogance was gone. His jokes fell flat. His smirk never returned. He spoke less, deferred more. It was as if the ghost knife had carved not just into his reputation, but into the very foundation of his authority. I didn't need to look at him to know the truth. He'd seen my file. He knew the weight of my call sign, the history tied to Reaper Zero. And he knew that the next time he tried to bury the truth, it wouldn't just be my stopwatch or my logbook waiting for him. It would be the system itself. Fallout in the military isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or breaking headlines. It comes with orders stamped in red, with names disappearing from rosters, with promotions that never arrive. It comes in the quiet shuffle of papers across a desk, the subtle pause before someone speaks your name, the sudden absence of laughter when you enter a room. For me, it came in the form of a single folded note slipped under my office door one evening. No signature, just 3 words written in block letters. They know now. I never found out who wrote it, but I didn't need to. The message was clear. The tide had turned. After the storm, the base felt different. Not louder, not more welcoming, just steadier. The undercurrent of tension that had followed me since day one had finally shifted. People no longer avoided me in corridors, no longer treated me like an anomaly in uniform. Instead, they treated me the way soldiers should treat each other, with measured respect. It wasn't friendship, not yet. Friendship in the military isn't built on moments of drama. It's built on long nights in briefing rooms, on drills that stretch past exhaustion, on the quiet exchange of trust when no one else is watching. What I had gained wasn't friendship. It was legitimacy. And legitimacy in our world is stronger than applause. At the range, the tone had changed entirely. I still timed my own starts, still carried the green notebook. But now, when I circled a number and set the pen down, the recruits leaned in, trying to learn what I had done differently. They didn't ask with smirks anymore. They asked with pens ready. I answered carefully, never raising my voice, never basking in authority. Because power taken too quickly burns out just as fast. Authority, real authority, comes from consistency. One morning, a lieutenant approached me as I was stowing gear. He was young, no more than 25, with the uncertain posture of someone who hadn't yet decided if he belonged in uniform. He cleared his throat. "Major, is it true you were Reaper Zero? From Bering Ridge?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "It's true." He nodded once, like that single confirmation anchored something inside him. He didn't press for details, didn't ask for the story. He just shouldered his pack with a new kind of quiet determination. That was enough. The shift wasn't limited to the younger ranks. Among senior officers, conversations around me began to change. Where once I had been dismissed as a formality, now my name carried weight. In planning sessions, when proposals were tossed on the table, someone would inevitably say, "Let's hear Major Hines' perspective." It wasn't deference. It was necessity. My credibility had become a resource, one they could no longer afford to ignore. I didn't indulge in satisfaction. If anything, I grew sharper. I stayed the first one in the office, the last one out. My reports were immaculate, cross-referenced, impossible to challenge. I let procedure be my shield, professionalism my weapon. Because I knew better than anyone how quickly tides could turn again. As for Hayes, he carried his own aftermath. His authority was no longer absolute. The sharp edges of his command style dulled with each passing week. He stopped mocking openly, stopped smirking at briefings. Instead, he spoke with a measured calm, as if each word had to pass through a filter of consequence before leaving his mouth. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was change. And in the rigid culture of the Navy, change at the top has a way of cascading downward. One evening, after a particularly long exercise cycle, I found a sealed envelope waiting on my desk. Inside was a simple transfer recommendation, a posting at the Naval Aviation Training Center in Pensacola. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't exile. It was recognition. They wanted me to instruct, to shape the next generation of pilots. I held the paper for a long time considering it. Part of me wanted to stay, to see the consequences through to the end. But another part, the part forged in the frozen skies of Alaska, understood that survival in this system wasn't about clinging to battles already won. It was about knowing when to move on. I signed the acceptance the next morning. The last weeks at San Diego were quiet. Hayes and I passed each other in the corridors without words, but also without hostility. There was no apology, no dramatic confrontation. just a mutual understanding carved from silence. The war between us was over. On my final day, as I walked down the long corridor lined with portraits of admirals past, I realized something. When I first walked this hallway, those stern faces had looked down on me like judges. Now they felt like witnesses. Witnesses to the fact that respect doesn't come from rank or from stars on a collar. It comes from the moments when protocol, truth, and dignity align. At Pensacola, I would carry those lessons forward. Not as stories to impress, not as legends to glorify, but as training to prepare others for the weight of command. Quiet professionalism, procedural integrity, and the hidden strength that outlasts arrogance. That would be my curriculum. Because in the end, that was the new term of my service. Not to fight for my own respect anymore, but to ensure the next generation never had to. The Navy teaches you a lot about silence. Silence during radio checks. Silence in a command room when a decision carries lives on its back. Silence in the seconds before impact, when a pilot's breath is the only sound left in the cockpit. But the silence I learned at San Diego was different. It was the silence of judgment, the kind that says, "You don't belong here." That silence had nearly swallowed me. Nearly convinced me that a smirk and a few cheap words could erase years of discipline, training, and survival. But silence only has power if you let it. And when protocol, receipts, and the truth spoke louder, the silence cracked. I think about Hayes sometimes, not as an admiral, not even as the man who mocked me in front of 40 officers, but as a brother who carried a burden too heavy to confess. The truth didn't destroy him. It changed him. That's the quiet power of consequence. It doesn't always come with handcuffs or demotions. Sometimes it comes with the weight of your own reflection, staring back from a mirror you can't look away from. And me? I didn't walk away a hero. Heroes are made of myths. What I carried was something quieter. The knowledge that dignity doesn't expire, that authority doesn't come from arrogance, and that respect, real respect, never comes cheap. It's paid for in patience, in protocol, and in the refusal to bend to humiliation. When recruits call me Reaper Zero now, I don't flinch. I don't correct them, and I don't let it inflate me. A call sign isn't about legend. It's about survival. And the responsibility that comes with still being here when others aren't. That's why when I stand before a new class of aviators in Pensacola, I don't tell them war stories to impress. I tell them about the stopwatch, about the cold corridors, about the silence that tried to erase me and the procedure that saved me, because those are the lessons that matter. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Dignity doesn't mean passive. And protocol isn't red tape. It's the shield that keeps arrogance in check. So let me leave you with this. Have you ever seen someone underestimated until the truth came out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Share this video with someone who understands that respect is never given freely. It's earned through truth. And remember, every day on this channel, a new story drops. Stories where arrogance meets discipline, where silence meets consequence, where the underestimated walk out with dignity and tact. This was mine. And tomorrow there'll be another.